Hello everybody. It is Coach Malcolm here today. Today I'm going to be going through one of the many exercises on chess.com, one of the lessons, and we are going to be doing the chapter on advanced endgames, common Rook endgames, because Rook endgames are, they are common. They're super common. They happen in games. I've had more Rook endgames and tournament games and blitz games, you name it, than I can possibly count. And sometimes they're super simple and easy to win. Ones where you are up a substantial amount of pawns and you just really need to get a pass pawn, and it's pretty easy to win. And there are others that are more tricky, especially when both sides have rooks and the pawns are a little less uneven. Sorry, there's not as big of a difference. So maybe only up one pawn or up two pawns, but they're split, or up two pawns, but they're connected. And there's different ones. So I thought today we would do these 5 challenges that are made because I think they'll be interesting. I think they'll be helpful in this position here that we're going to start off with. Obviously, black does not have a rook, but it's still an important position because, well, let's take a second. Let's try and understand this position. The first thing is our white king is on the 8th rank back here, okay? And this pawn is obviously going towards the 1st rank over here. So the white king, the point is this white king is pretty far. In addition, the black king is guarding these squares, right? The king wants to make its way over to this pawn as much as it can, but this black king is blocking it. So it's up to this rook to try and stop this b4 pawn from promoting, right? And you may be thinking rook b1 makes the most sense, right? Rook b1 attacks the pawn. Why would we not play rook b1? And the reason is after rook b1, the king would get to play c5. And sure, your white king would get to go to c7, but by this point, this black king has gained a little too much progress, and the rook is not strong enough to take on this pawn. If it was a queen, totally different story. But this king is going to keep pushing to c4, then maybe come to c3 or push b3, and our white king is not going to be there fast enough to catch up. That may be hard to visualize, and after I solve it, we can maybe do some analysis and see if that's if the website will allow us to do that. So you may also be thinking rook g4 makes a lot of sense. We're still attacking this pawn. It's a really great idea. But very similarly, black could play king to c5, guarding that pawn, and then they're going to play b3, continue to push, and again, our white king is just a little too far away to have a lot of influence. So this should also tell you something about why it's important, especially when it's king-rook versus a pawn that's trying to promote. It's important to have your king as close to that pawn as possible because you're trying to capture it. So, what is the move? We obviously need to separate these two because if we've noticed one thing, it's when we play rook b1 or rook g4, this king comes to c5, guards the pawn, often comes to c4 and helps it push. So how are we going to do that? Take a second, pause if you need to. We're going to play this move, rook to g5. And rook g5 is super important. It cuts the king off on the 5th rank. And really the only option is to push this pawn. Now once the pawn is pushed, now we have the opportunity to go after it. There's no king c5 here to guard the pawn. We would just take it. And once that pawn pushes yet again, rook b3 is going to completely stop it. Okay? And we are going to pick up this pawn. And I think this is very important, right? It may seem super simple. If you get this position, you think I can stop this easily. You really have to play this rook g5 move. Is just so important. All right, let us move on to our next puzzle now. This is white to move again, okay? And this black pawn is going to a1 because sometimes it's hard to orient ourselves. And the question is, so obviously the black king is trying to get to b2 to help promote the pawn, and we want to draw this as white. That is the plan. We are trying to draw this position. Now, there's something we have to be very careful of. I said in our last position, we need to get our white king as close to this pawn as possible, right? And maybe that means bringing our king over. In this case, that is not true whatsoever. And we're going to have to picture for a second, and we'll analyze at the end. If we play something like king to e2, black has a super cool tactic, and that is rook h1. Once white takes on a2, black will play rook h2, skewering the king on e2 and the rook on a2, which I'll show you in a second. So instead, same thing would happen if we played king f2, rook h1, and if the king goes after the rook, then black gets to promote. So here we need to play king g2, because now rook h1 is not an option. Of course, we would just take it. Once this king moves into b4, we're going to move as far away as humanly possible. It is going to continue to try and get to this pawn, right? It wants to get to b2, and then move away, move the rook out of the way to promote the pawn. But what are we going to do? We're going to be a little bit annoying and give this king a ton of checks. The challenge ends here because we would just check this king over and over and over and over again, never let him get to that b2 square. Let's go back 1 second just to take a look so I can show you guys this tactic in case it was unclear. In this position, if king e2 is played, rook h1, rook takes, you'll see the analysis completely shifts. Rook h2, this is the skewer I was talking about, and now this is a super easy win for black. So that is why king g2 is super important. This puzzle is also important to notice because if you're in the game and your opponent does make the mistake of a king f2 move, or puts his king on any of these squares, f, e, d, right? Because if it's on c, it'll guard the rook, but if it's on d, e, or f in a position like this, rook h1, or if it's on the white pieces, something like rook a8 or rook h8 is super smart. Alright, our third challenge of the day, white to move again. What is our goal? We are trying to win this game, okay? We're up the pawn. We want to promote our pawn to this key a8 square. Well, what's the problem? It's being attacked. Any king move is not going to make any sense, right? If we play something like king a4, the rook's just going to take, and that's going to be a very easily drawn position. King rook is obviously a draw. Another idea we might be thinking about is rook a8, trying to guard this a6 pawn, which it does, completely it guards the a6 pawn, but as we saw in our last puzzle, when your rook is in front of the pawn, it is super hard to promote. Likely this black king, well, first of all, this white rook will go to a6, get behind the pawn, which is where you want to be, and then this black king is just going to head on over to g7 like we talked about, and have a pretty easy time, have a pretty easy time stopping it, and this black rook is going to continue to make checks. So if we just picture it, rook a8, king g6, pawn a7, rook a6 check, and then king g7, we have a very similar position. That is going to be a draw. So we need to get behind the pawn, which means we are pushing this pawn forward. That is how you want to almost always play these endgames. So lucky for us, we have an awesome check. Check this king. Now we can head on over to a5. We are pushing this pawn forward, doing a great job. We're going to continue, play a7, and now, who do we need to involve? Our king, of course. King b4. This king is going to head on over to b7, and we are going to win this game as white if it were a real game. Alright, our fourth challenge. Now, again, it says right here, like I was saying, guys, rooks belong behind pass pawns. We need to have our rooks behind these pawns, okay? So we're playing for black here. Again, we're trying to win. We're up the pawn, quite clearly. And this pawn is heading towards b1, okay? Let's just orient ourselves yet again. So, what was something I was talking about over and over? If you are trying to draw, you need your king to be involved in the position, right? Or even if you're trying to win, you need your king to be involved. So, as black, how can we make this king, how can we exclude this king from the position here? How can we make it so that this king is going to have a lot of trouble stopping this pawn from pushing down the board, and our king is going to have a fun old time pushing alongside right next to that pawn. Alright, hopefully you found this move, rook to c8. Cutting off this entire file, guys. We can analyze for 1 second because the puzzle or the challenge sort of cuts it off pretty quickly there. But rook c8, this is winning for black, of course. We are cutting off this entire file. It's even hard to say what white might play here. Maybe they'll just, find a square for their rook. We are going to play king a4, push this pawn to b3, right? Again, white does not have any moves, right? They can't move their king. They can't make progress. The rook can't go to c3 because our pawn is there. Maybe they'll play back. Now we can play king b3, right? And if we say, let's say maybe they move their rook again, then we play b3. If they play rook c3, this is clearly a mistake. Rook takes, king a3. We'll get to push this pawn in this position. This is just a winning position for black. This move, though, this often happens in Rook Endgames, cutting off the king with your rook on an open file or rank. Very important concept. Okay, our final challenge of the day. White is in a very bad position, the puzzle says. It looks hopeless for white, but of course, we are not going to be giving up hope. We are going to be trying to draw this game as white. But let's look at black's ideas. First of all, black obviously has 2 pawns in this position. Our king is trapped on the 7th. Yes, it is close to these pawns, right? Close to these promoting squares, on one of the promoting squares even, but it is a dangerous place to be. Because after king a3, if black got 2 moves, let's say, which of course, it's just for the purpose of thinking about threats, king a3, pawn b2 is checkmate if black got 2 moves, right? If we tried, we can't even go rook b1 because the pawn is attacking it. Rook c1, we would run into king a3. If we try to play rook c3 to stop this pawn from moving, then rook f1 is going to lead to checkmate, right? Because we're also worried about back rank threats. A lot of problems are on the table for white in this situation, okay? So, the question becomes, what do we do? Well, we have to start off with rook e4 check, okay? We need to attack this white king. Oftentimes, checks are the best way to try and get a draw in positions like this. Does that mean always go for the check? Not at all. But always keep in mind, in an endgame where you are losing and trying to go for a draw, that perpetual checks or just annoying that king by checking back and forth, like we also saw in the first puzzle, can sometimes work. So, the king goes to c3. Yet again, we are going to play check. King moves to c2. Now, tell me if you can find the winning move. Not winning, sorry. Winning the puzzle, but the drawing move here for white. Hopefully we found rook e2. Super smart. I want to analyze this because there's a lot to unpack here. Not a lot to unpack, but it's just important to look into it. King c3, rook e3. Important to notice, if this king moves back to b4, we're just going to check again. Same thing with c4. And if this king moves to d2 or d4, now we're going to get to take on b3, and now we're going to be able to draw this quite easily. And the point is, after king c2, they are trying to obviously push b2, b1. We check yet again. If rook takes, this is a stalemate position. You'll see the engine has established it as a draw right here. Right, this pawn is protected, and the king guards these two squares. We have no moves as white. Alright, that concludes the 5 endgame rook challenges for the day. What are the main takeaways? The main takeaways are king involvement in these endgames, which I'm sure you've heard tons and tons of times. King involvement, having your king be involved, whether you're trying to draw and take away pawns in a rook and pawn and rook endgame, whether you're trying to help support the pawn. Open files, right? Cutting off squares for the kings. That goes hand in hand, right? The king tries to get in, you try and stop your opponent's ideas. Also, a very common theme was checks, right? Checks are often used in rook endgames to get draws. And the fourth thing, which is not sort of a big theme, but a very common puzzle, is where you will see from our very first puzzle. Maybe if we restart the lesson. Yes, from our very first puzzle. Okay, not our very first puzzle. I apologize. What am I doing? Okay, rook b3. We've already solved this one. This puzzle right here. This, and knowing this puzzle, this is a very common puzzle. This is one of the endgame tactical puzzles you should know, is if this king moves to f2, this neat rook h1 move that will indeed skewer the king and rook, or at the very least allow black to promote their pawn and be up a rook in the endgame. That is a very important tactic I just wanted to remind everybody about. I hope that going through this lesson, with a coach, understanding a lot of the ideas, maybe some that you wouldn't even notice if you went through it by yourself, was helpful. I hope to see you guys use this in your games, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.